The turmoil across the world continues, and the Chinese real estate crisis is getting worse by the day. As the builders in China are defaulting one by one, across the Atlantic in USA, the housing market is in a bubble of seismic proportions. And if that was not enough, the supply chain crisis is impacting the economies across the globe, and meanwhile, the energy crisis in China is causing blackouts across many cities. But there is a storm brewing under the surface which dwarfs all these issues, and it is rooted in the same problem which obliterated the Roman Empire. It is the same problem which caused Second World War, and it is the same problem which is currently shattering the foundations of not only the major European economies and USA, but also some of the biggest economies in Asia. This problem can lead to a major crisis at any time, and once the volcano erupts, it will be devastating for our livelihood and for our future generations for decades. In this connected world, a turmoil going on in one major economy can ripple across the world in a matter of days. It won't be an exaggeration to state that this upcoming crisis will be orders of magnitude potent than the Lehman Brothers crisis of 2008, as well as the other market crashes in history. The alarming fact is that all major economies have exactly the same disease and the symptoms are already obvious. And this situation is very alarming because a crisis in one major economy can lead to a chain reaction which will engulf the world in a storm the likes of which have never been witnessed by humanity. The scale of it, the severity of it, and the impact of it will be catastrophic despite our indifference, despite the fact that we are closing our eyes, and despite the fact that most of us are numb to the events that are leading to this Armageddon. Now let's dive deep into the topic. After the World War I, the Germany's debt was so crushing that it took 92 years to pay off. The Treaty of Versailles called for punishing reparations, and the resulting economic collapse triggered events that eventually led to another world war. And with the German economy torn to shreds by the resulting economic collapse, its ability to pay back the debt was shattered. And yes, the money ultimately came from the pockets of German taxpayers, and it kept on coming from their pockets for around a century. And if you think that Germans were not right, they asked for this treatment, they had bad designs, and they caused the war, therefore they faced the consequences. Think again. You might be in the same boat as German taxpayers and enjoying the fruits of the brilliant decisions which politicians in your country made. Their paychecks come from our taxes. They make us pay for the loans that the countries took under their leadership at the expense of our prospects. So of course UK won the Second World War, but strangely the taxpayers in UK had to suffer in exactly and precisely the same way as the German taxpayers. And a portion of their tax bills went to pay the installments of these loans for decades. Yes, they went to the streets to celebrate the victory, but at the end of the war, as I mentioned, the taxpayers of both the countries had to face the same consequences, and they were indebted for decades, and honestly, many decades. So during the Second World War, Britain was running out of money fast. So of course, the only solution was to borrow money from USA, Canada, and yes, from their future taxpayers. These loans resulted in a situation where the Britain's debt to GDP ratio went through the roof and reached a staggering 200% of its GDP. The situation was alarming since according to World Bank, if a country's debt to GDP ratio goes over 77%, it can have a devastating effect on the economy since a large portion of its GDP goes to pay the interest on the loan. Britain did get lucky, in fact very lucky, since the economic reforms worked out. The influx of taxpayers including immigrants who worked in the factories contributed to the economy. Furthermore, the baby boomers and a continuous inflow of highly skilled people from former British colonies also contributed immensely to UK's economy. Despite all these factors acting in favor of Britain, it took UK not just an year or a decade, but around 6 decades to pay the last installment of the loan to the Allies. And I will soon share some data with you which will shock you. It will be like an eye-opener, but first, let's see what has been going on in the UK after 2008 debt crisis and afterwards we will have a look at the situation in USA. Then we will dig into the data to see the crystal clear view of the underlying causes of this situation. And if you think that, oh no, this was war, it was inevitable for the UK to get debt and it was justified for the government to do that, let's see what happened after 2008 financial crisis. So after the crash, the subsequent bailout of several banks by the UK government followed. And it had painful and far-reaching repercussions for the taxpayers in the UK. The Treasury pledged to spend 1.2 trillion on the bailout since the crisis began, and it costs taxpayers up to 5 billion pounds a year just to service the loan that the crisis incurred. I mean, I don't know when the word country popped up in English dictionary. One thing is for sure that before First World War there were no countries. Maybe it is something which was done on purpose to implicitly enslave masses by a clan of politicians or dictators who are obsessed with sucking the wealth of people in the piece of land that they rule or govern. Now let's have a look at the situation in USA before we look at the important data. So let's do a reality check of USA, where the government happily spends more money than it collects in taxes. And the amazing reality is that it borrows even more money to make up for the shortfall. So it is a snowball that is becoming huge with every passing day with no end in sight. In 1939, Congress established a ceiling on how much debt the government can accumulate. And you will be surprised to know that this ceiling has been lifted on more than 100 occasions in the past, allowing the government to borrow even more debt each time. So it means that this ceiling is not that strong, and maybe we have to change the meaning of the word ceiling in English dictionary. And this proves that the government will keep on accumulating more and more debt at the expense of US taxpayers who must pay for it. And now let's go into some shocking data, which will reveal that on one hand the governments are indebting their countries, and on the other hand also making the fiat currencies worthless by printing them via central banks. So if putting more and more debt on the shoulders of citizens was not enough, the politicians gave the masses another gift in the form of inflation, making their savings worthless. Just look at this graph. Since 1912, US dollar has lost 30 times its value, meaning 3000%. And same was the case of Weimar inflation in Germany. Indeed, history repeats itself. Just after 2 calendar years after the First World War, as you can see in the beginning of 1900s, one gold mark was worth one paper mark. By the end of 1923, it was 1 trillion. Let that sink in. 1 trillion paper mark. And honestly, we don't have to go too back in time either to gauge the disasters caused by inflation and huge national debt. Look at what happened in Greece in 2012, Zimbabwe in 2006, and Venezuela in 2017. And yes, the most recent one. In 2020, Argentina defaulted for a second time in 20 years, and it is Argentina's ninth overall default. The severity of this situation is alarming since across the globe, all the major economies have the same problem. UK, USA and Japan have well over 100% debt to GDP ratio, and that is catastrophic for their economies. And in Japan, things seems to have reached a point of no return. It has a staggering debt to GDP percentage of 237%. And who is suffering the most in this situation? Of course, the middle class, since a part of their tax cut goes to paying the installment and interest of the government loan. And as shown in this infographic, we can see that the debt snowball has engulfed the national economies across the globe. The cancer of debt has spread across the world and is devastating for the economic progress of the countries. In the infographic, the most indebted nations are near the middle of the debt snowball. And surely due to the adverse effect of pandemics such as lockdowns, the government debt accelerated drastically. But even before that, the government debt has been increasing at an alarming rate. The stimulus checks in USA and the bounce back loans for entrepreneurs and other measures taken by the UK government to revive the economy have made the situation worse, since the pandemic has suppressed the ability of governments to generate tax revenues. This simply means that the taxpayers will have to carry the burden of these loans for many decades to come in the same way as before. Many countries across the world are yet to pay the debt taken after the Second World War. Also, it means that the economic growth of the countries will slow down since there won't be enough money to pay for social welfare, healthcare, infrastructure, and education. Of course, UK and USA might not default on their loans in the near future, but we and our future generation will have to pay it back in the form of higher taxes. And this is not all. The households in USA are carrying 16 trillion US dollars of debt too. On average, each household has around $100,000 of debt. And even worse, on average, US households have under 8,000 US dollars of savings, which are not enough to support them for even a few months. Also, it is shocking to see that US citizens under the age of 30 have on average around 2,000 US dollars of saving only, which is not enough to support them for even a couple of months. Furthermore, if that was not enough, the student loans account for around 611 billion US dollars. I am convinced that the government debt will be piling up further in the future. Another reality is the increasing unemployment and social unrest. Many countries like Argentina and Venezuela are already in a bad state and have defaulted. We have already gone beyond the 2008 crisis in terms of unemployment levels. Therefore, I am convinced that we will see an economic meltdown that will be more severe than the Great Depression. And this was about the developed countries. In developing countries, the situation is even worse since the IMF and World Bank have already suspended the debt payments of many developing countries, and the reason is that they cannot afford to pay the installments of public debt. And of course, the central banks are further amplifying the problem by printing fiat currencies at unbelievable rates. One of the main motives of this activity is to pay back the government loan, but that eventually results in devaluation of the currency and robs citizens out of their wealth by suffocating their purchasing power. Therefore, in my opinion, we might be headed towards the worst economic crisis in history, fueled by debt and inflation. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think about the debt crisis and inflation and the impact of it on our lives and on the lives of our future generations. Also, kindly hit the like button for the YouTube algorithm, and I will really appreciate if you kindly hit the subscribe button and also click the notifications bell so that you can get the notifications of the future videos in time. I will be grateful for your support. Thank you very much for your time. Take care and have a nice day.